Alright, I'm going to tell you something that nobody knows the full truth about. And honestly, at this point, I don't really care what anyone thinks of me. My name is Vanessa, and I'm 27 years old. This whole thing started back when I was an overweight girl who barely got noticed by anyone. So when Brandon finally proposed to me, I honestly felt like I'd hit the jackpot. Looking back now, there were plenty of warning signs I probably should have paid attention to, but that's beside the point. What's done is done, and here we are. Brandon and I had been together for 9 damn years before he finally decided to propose. 9 years. During that time, he'd seen me at my absolute worst. I'm talking about carrying around an extra 50 kilos, rotating between the same 3 oversized hoodies, and ordering takeout practically every night because I couldn't even find the energy to cook. I was basically a walking vegetable back then. And somehow, Brandon acted like there was absolutely nothing wrong with that. He'd sit right there beside me, eating pizza and playing video games just like I did, almost like we'd already been an old married couple for decades. The proposal itself probably should have been my first clue that this guy didn't have much ambition. There was nothing romantic or special about it. It happened on a completely ordinary Tuesday night, in our messy apartment, surrounded by containers of leftover Chinese food. Right there on our dirty carpet, Brandon dropped to one knee and pulled out this tiny ring that probably cost him about 2 months' salary from his regular office job. He told me he loved me exactly the way I was and wanted to spend the rest of his life with me. At the time, I thought it was sweet. Now, though, part of me wonders if he was simply relieved that someone like me had actually said yes. It was almost like he wanted to lock the relationship down before I ever realized I might be worth more. But the second I said yes, something changed inside my head. Suddenly, I wasn't just somebody's girlfriend anymore. I was going to be a bride. And there was no way in hell I wanted to become one of those women who looked back at their wedding pictures years later and hated what they saw. So I told Brandon we weren't setting a wedding date until I reached my goal weight. He looked confused when I said it. He kept insisting that I was already beautiful and that there was no reason for us to wait. But honestly, that response only proved to me that he didn't understand what I was talking about. Of course Brandon thought I looked fine. Even when I was at my worst, he'd never been with anyone better than me. The following week, I officially started trying to lose weight. Brandon tried to support me, but he did it in that incredibly annoying way some guys do when they have absolutely no idea what you're actually going through. One minute, he'd suggest that we start working out together. The next minute, he'd ask if I wanted to order pizza. He'd buy me protein bars because he wanted to be supportive, then act hurt when I wouldn't split dessert with him later that night. It was almost like he wanted me to succeed, but only up to a certain point. Deep down, it felt like he also wanted me to stay exactly where I'd always been, because that version of me felt safe to him. But the weight started coming off much faster than I'd expected. And with every pound I lost, I began noticing things changing around me. It wasn't only my body that was different. The way people treated me started changing too. Suddenly, cashiers smiled at me instead of staring straight through me. Guys started holding doors open and actually making eye contact. Women who would have barely acknowledged me before suddenly included me in conversations. Brandon kept telling me how proud he was, but I could tell something about my transformation was making him nervous. He started making these little jokes about how much I was changing. He'd say things like he hoped I wouldn't forget about ordinary people once I got skinny. It was supposed to be funny. But underneath the joke, I could hear this weird sense of desperation, and honestly, it started getting on my nerves. Over the next several months, I'd lost 80 pounds, and that's when I started getting real attention from men. I'm not talking about guys simply being polite anymore. I mean genuine interest. The guy at the coffee shop started drawing little hearts in the foam of my drinks. One of my coworkers suddenly kept inventing reasons to stop by my desk. Even Brandon's friend Mason commented on how lucky Brandon was. And that got me thinking. Was Brandon really the lucky one? Or was I the one settling? By the time I finally reached my goal and had lost 100 pounds, I felt like an entirely different person. I'd look into the mirror and see a woman who actually had options now. Real options. Brandon celebrated by arranging a special dinner at home for just the two of us. The entire evening, he kept telling me how incredible I looked and how proud he was of everything I'd accomplished. But while I sat across from him, watching him wear the same old sweatshirt and eat the same takeout we'd been ordering for years, my mind kept drifting toward all those men who had recently started noticing me. Men who were taller. Men who were more successful. Men who actually had ambition. Men who seemed like they'd fit naturally beside this new version of me. Brandon still treated me like I was the exact same girl who had eagerly said yes when he proposed. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I'd changed. I'd become better. And somewhere along the way, I started believing that maybe I deserved better too. The grocery store actually became one of my favorite places because that's where I met this ridiculously attractive guy. He was tall, probably close to 6'3", tattooed, with an amazing smile, and everything he wore looked designer. One day, while we were standing near the organic food section, he complimented my tattoo and straight up asked me for my number. I know he saw my engagement ring. He asked anyway. And to me, that was confidence. That's how a real man behaves when he sees something he wants. Of course, I told Brandon about it that same evening because I'm not a liar. I explained that this extremely attractive guy had started flirting with me at the grocery store. Brandon immediately started acting weird about it. He began firing off all these irritating questions. What did the guy look like? What exactly did he say? Did I give him my number? When I told Brandon I hadn't, he seemed to relax a little. But then he said something that really bothered me. He told me my engagement ring should be enough to protect me from other guys. Protect me? Like attention from better options was somehow something I needed protection from. That pissed me off. Then there was this personal trainer at my gym. The guy had abs you could practically grate cheese on, and somehow he was always nearby asking whether I needed help with my form. Whenever he demonstrated an exercise, he'd stand just a little closer than necessary. And honestly, I didn't exactly mind. Brandon never worked out with me anyway. Every time I suggested it, he had another excuse about being exhausted after work. Meanwhile, this trainer started sending me workout advice and motivational quotes. Before long, I found myself looking forward to his messages way more than Brandon's boring texts asking how my day was going. Things at work started getting interesting too. Our company brought in a new guy as part of a management training program. He'd just finished his MBA, wore an expensive watch, and drove a BMW. Pretty soon, he started having lunch at my table. We'd talk about his plans for the future, how he wanted to move up in the company, and how maybe one day he'd start his own business. He had ambition. Actual goals. A real plan for where his life was going. Meanwhile, Brandon had been doing the same job for 3 years without any serious plan to move up. Whenever I brought up how successful this new guy at work seemed to be, Brandon would just grumble something under his breath and change the subject. And the more attention I started receiving from other men, the more I realized how much I felt I'd been missing all those years. For the first time, I really started studying Brandon. I mean actually looking at him. I noticed the thinning hair he tried to hide beneath that stupid baseball cap. I noticed his stomach hanging over his belt, even though he'd been promising for months that he'd start working out next week. I noticed how he'd rather spend an evening playing video games than take me somewhere interesting. And most of all, I noticed his complete lack of ambition. He didn't seem interested in improving himself or becoming anything more than the person he'd already settled into being. I didn't think I was being cruel. I thought I was being realistic. Then one evening, after I'd had a couple glasses of wine, I finally told Brandon about the thoughts I'd been having. It wasn't anything terrible. I just admitted that sometimes I imagined what my life might be like with someone more successful. Someone who could give me the kind of life I now felt I deserved. Someone taller. Someone more financially secure. Someone with ambition. Someone who would actually look like he belonged next to the new version of me. I honestly thought Brandon would understand what I was trying to say. Maybe hearing it would even motivate him to step up and start working on himself. Instead, he got offended and immediately asked me if I wanted to break up with him. I had to calm him down and explain that I still loved him. But seriously, was it really so terrible for me to wonder what else might be out there? After that conversation, Brandon became even more insecure and clingy, and honestly, it only pushed me further away. Whenever I was at the gym, he'd constantly text me asking when I was coming home. Suddenly, he wanted us to have dinner together every single night. Before all this, I would usually make myself something healthy while he ordered whatever takeout he felt like eating. Now, though, it felt suffocating. It was almost like he was desperately trying to stop me from enjoying this new life I'd built for myself. And the worst part was how personally he took everything whenever I mentioned getting attention from other men. I wasn't bragging. I wasn't deliberately trying to hurt him. I was simply telling him what happened during my day, the way couples normally do. But every time I mentioned my trainer helping me with weightlifting, or a coworker asking what I was doing over the weekend, Brandon would get this pathetic expression on his face. Then came the passive-aggressive comments. He kept saying I'd changed and that he missed the old me. The old me? I used to be miserable and practically invisible. Why would anyone miss that version of me? So I started spending even more time at the gym. Partly because I genuinely enjoyed my new routine, but also because Brandon's constant insecurity and emotional outbursts were driving me insane. After workouts, my trainer and I would sometimes have protein shakes together. He'd tell me about his weekend plans, hiking, beach volleyball, or whatever other active thing he had lined up. Meanwhile, Brandon's idea of the perfect weekend was ordering Chinese food and binge-watching some Netflix series. The contrast between those two lifestyles was getting harder and harder for me to ignore. Things were changing at work too. My coworkers started inviting me to evening networking events and professional meetups that could actually help me move forward in my career. When I told Brandon about them, his first question was why he couldn't come along. He completely missed the point. These weren't date nights. They were professional events where I was trying to build connections and establish a new image for myself. Brandon didn't understand that side of the new me. I wanted to surround myself with people who shared my ambition, people who had goals and actually wanted something more from life. Then Brandon started doing something else that irritated me. He began surprising me with all my old favorite foods. Pizza. Ice cream. Those disgusting greasy snacks we used to split between the two of us. Whenever I politely turned them down because I was committed to my new lifestyle, he'd look hurt and ask if we could at least share some, like the good old days. But those weren't the good old days to me anymore. It felt like he was trying to drag me back into being that same overweight, invisible girl because that version of me was easier for him to handle. Then came the moment when everything really started falling apart. One of my coworkers invited us to a housewarming party. A bunch of young professionals from the office were going to be there with their partners, and I was genuinely excited. Being invited made me feel like I was finally becoming part of that circle. But the second I told Brandon about it, he started complaining. He said he wouldn't know anybody there and that it would probably be awkward. Then he suggested we skip the whole thing, stay home, and watch a movie instead. I refused. I wanted to go. So eventually, Brandon came with me. And he spent almost the entire evening sitting in a corner, sulking and barely speaking to anyone. Meanwhile, I was having incredible conversations with successful people about their careers, future goals, and travel plans. At one point, my coworker introduced me to someone as a brilliant professional. That stuck with me. For once, I felt valued for what I could actually do, not simply introduced as Brandon's fiancé. On the drive home, Brandon barely said a word. Then suddenly, he exploded. He accused me of ignoring him the entire evening and said it seemed more important to me to impress my coworkers than to spend time with him. I tried explaining that networking mattered if I wanted to advance in my career. but he just didn't get it. Finally, he looked at me and said, "You used to care about us. Now I don't even recognize you." And that's when everything clicked for me. Brandon was holding me back. He had been comfortable with the old version of me because that meant he never had to grow. He didn't have to change, challenge himself, or become anything more. But my transformation threatened him. Because every improvement I made forced him to look at how little he was changing himself. From there, our relationship only became more tense. And honestly, I was exhausted from pretending everything was okay. It felt like I was living two completely different lives. Everywhere else, I was becoming this confident, ambitious new version of myself. But the second I walked through our front door, Brandon expected me to turn back into the same girl who had once happily said yes to his proposal. Everything finally reached a boiling point one Saturday night. We were sitting at home drinking wine and watching some dumb action movie Brandon had picked. I was relaxed. Probably a little too relaxed. And Brandon wouldn't stop talking about wedding plans. He wanted to reserve some completely ordinary venue near his parents' house. Nothing memorable. Nothing exciting. Just convenient. Then he started talking about asking his cousin's band to play at the reception and buying flowers wholesale to save money for our honeymoon. And where did he want to go for the honeymoon? Florida. Not some exotic island. Not Europe. Not anywhere I'd dreamed about. Just Florida, because apparently he still had some timeshare points we could use. I sat there listening to him plan this bargain basement version of our wedding, and all I could think about was what kind of wedding someone like my coworker would plan. Or my trainer. Hell, even that guy from the grocery store. Those men seemed like the kind who understood that special occasions deserved to actually feel special. They weren't the type of men I imagined suggesting wholesale flowers for one of the most important days of a woman's life. Maybe it was the wine talking, but I finally decided to be completely honest with Brandon. Not the softened version I'd given him before. The real version. I told him about the life I dreamed of having. I wanted to be with someone who could give me the kind of life I now believed I deserved. Someone with a corner office instead of some cramped little cubicle. Someone who wore suits instead of graphic t-shirts. Someone tall, successful, and ambitious. Someone who would actually look right standing beside me. Then I told him everything. I told him about the guy at the grocery store who'd asked for my number. I told him how my trainer always found time to help me at the gym. And I told him how my coworker treated me like an equal instead of acting like I was some fragile little thing that needed constant protection. Brandon just stared at me. For a few seconds, he looked like he was trying to process everything I'd just said. Then he quietly asked me if I wanted to end our engagement. That was it. No asking how we could fix things. No asking what I needed from him. No promises that he'd try harder. Just, "Do you want to end the engagement?" I immediately backed off. I explained that I wasn't saying I wanted to leave him. But was it really so awful for me to occasionally wonder what else was out there? Was it wrong to want a partner who matched the standards I had now? I'd worked incredibly hard to improve myself. I'd pushed myself to change. I'd become someone better. And in my mind, that meant I'd become worthy of more too. Yet Brandon acted like wanting more was somehow a terrible thing. After that, he became strangely quiet. He wouldn't even look at me. I tried to lighten the mood and suggested we just go to bed, but Brandon shook his head and said he needed some time to think. Think about what? Whether he was finally going to become the man I deserved? Or whether he planned to stay exactly the same, this ordinary, unambitious guy who wanted to marry me in some cheap community hall decorated with supermarket flowers? The next morning, Brandon seemed different. Cold. Distant. Almost worn down. He barely even said hello to me. Brandon just poured himself a cup of coffee and started scrolling through his phone like I wasn't even there. When I tried to bring up what had happened the night before, he simply said we'd talk about it later. Then he left for work without even kissing me goodbye. In 9 years together, he'd never done that. I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation the entire day at work. Maybe I'd been a little too honest with him. But wasn't honesty supposed to be the foundation of a healthy relationship? It wasn't like I was asking Brandon to turn into a completely different human being. I just wanted him to improve himself. I wanted him to rise to my level and show me that he understood I deserved more than the bare minimum. One of my coworkers noticed I seemed distracted and asked if everything was okay. When I briefly mentioned that Brandon and I were having relationship problems, he suggested we grab coffee after work and talk about it. And honestly, he was an incredible listener. He asked thoughtful questions, actually paid attention to my answers, and seemed genuinely interested in understanding how I felt. He didn't immediately become defensive the way Brandon always seemed to. When I finally got home after having coffee with my coworker, Brandon was still acting strange. He'd made dinner, which was unusual. By then, I normally prepared my own meals because I was careful about what I ate. He'd even cleaned the apartment. That immediately made me suspicious because Brandon only cleaned like that when something serious was going on. Throughout dinner, he had this tense expression that I couldn't quite read. Finally, he put his fork down and looked directly at me. "We need to talk about what you said last night." Well, here we go, I thought. I figured one of two things was about to happen. Either Brandon would promise to change and finally get himself together, or he'd have another emotional meltdown because I'd hurt his feelings. What I absolutely wasn't prepared for was how calm and direct he sounded. He told me he'd spent the entire day thinking about everything I'd said. My dreams. The other men. My comments about deserving something better. And he'd made a decision. He was canceling the wedding. Not postponing it. Not taking a temporary break so we could work through our problems. Canceling it completely. I actually laughed at first because I assumed he was being dramatic. Brandon didn't make huge decisions like that. This was a man who could spend 20 minutes staring at a restaurant menu because he couldn't decide what he wanted to order. But Brandon wasn't laughing. He told me he'd spent all day realizing that maybe I was right. Maybe I really did deserve someone better than him. But then he said something I wasn't expecting. He deserved better too. He deserved someone who didn't constantly fantasize about other men and make him feel like he was never good enough. Brandon said he'd loved me for 9 years exactly as I was. But he couldn't keep loving someone who treated him like a temporary placeholder until a better option came along. I immediately tried explaining that he'd misunderstood everything. I wasn't actively searching for another man. I was trying to motivate him. I wanted him to become better for us. All those comments about other men, all that honesty about what I wanted from life, I thought they would push him to work harder. I thought they'd inspire him to prove that he could become the man I needed. Instead, he was giving up without even trying. Brandon just shook his head. He told me he was exhausted from feeling like he had to audition for my approval every single day. Then he said the woman he'd originally proposed to would have never sat there talking about fantasizing over other men or constantly made him feel like he wasn't enough. That woman, he said, had actually loved him. But this new version of me didn't love Brandon. She loved the idea of who Brandon might become if he changed practically everything about himself. The worst part wasn't even what he said. It was how he said it. There was no anger in his voice. No yelling. No dramatic accusations. He just sounded tired. Almost like he'd already mourned our relationship and moved past it before we'd even finished the conversation. Brandon told me he was going to stay with a friend for a few days while we figured out how to separate 9 years of our lives. 9 years. And he was willing to throw all of it away just because I'd been honest about my feelings. I asked him if this was seriously what he wanted. Was he really going to let his bruised ego destroy everything we'd built together? He told me it wasn't about his ego. It was about self-respect. He said he deserved to be with someone who enthusiastically chose him every single day. Not someone who settled for him while constantly looking around to see whether something better had become available. Before he left, Brandon gently slid my engagement ring across the kitchen table toward me. Then he told me he genuinely hoped I'd find whatever it was I was searching for. He said he hoped the person I eventually ended up with would be worthy of the woman I'd become. And then he left. That was it. No screaming match. No dramatic scene. He packed a bag and walked out the door like 9 years together meant nothing to him. I sat there for what felt like forever, staring at my engagement ring on the kitchen table. I couldn't believe he'd actually done it. All I'd done was tell him the truth about my feelings and my personal growth. I wanted him to grow too. I wanted him to become the kind of man who deserved this new version of me. Instead, he'd chosen to throw everything away without even trying. And honestly, those first few weeks after Brandon left were surprisingly liberating. I didn't have to deal with his constant neediness anymore. There were no more passive-aggressive comments about how much I'd changed. I could spend as long as I wanted at the gym without finding 20 messages on my phone asking when I'd be home. I could grab drinks with a coworker after work without having to explain myself to anybody. For the first time in years, I felt completely free to become this new version of myself without someone constantly trying to pull me backward. So I threw myself into my new life. My coworker and I started spending more time together, and he introduced me to his circle of young professionals. These were people who understood ambition. They talked about goals, careers, investments, travel, and success instead of spending every conversation complaining about their jobs. My trainer and I started going hiking together on weekends, and he helped me put together a whole new workout program. Even the guy from the grocery store eventually found his way back into my life. A few weeks later, I ran into him at the grocery store again. This time, I gave him my number myself. We ended up going to this incredible restaurant downtown. For the first few weeks, I honestly thought I'd been right about everything. This was exactly what I'd been missing while I was with Brandon. These men treated me the way I believed I deserved to be treated. They took me to restaurants and places Brandon would have never even considered. We talked about careers, goals, travel, and things that actually felt important. For a while, it seemed like I'd finally entered the kind of life I'd been dreaming about. Then things started getting weird. My coworker, the guy who'd seemed so fascinated by me as a person, eventually made it pretty clear that he expected our friendship to become physical. When I reminded him that I was still emotionally dealing with the end of a 9-year relationship, he basically told me that was something I needed to figure out on my own. He wasn't interested in waiting around while I worked through my feelings. Then I discovered my trainer was seeing 3 other women from the gym. When I tried bringing up the possibility of something more serious between us, he actually laughed. He told me he'd assumed I understood that he wasn't the relationship type. But the grocery store guy was probably the worst. After taking me out for 2 expensive dinners, he apparently decided that meant I owed him something. When I told him I wasn't ready to become intimate with him, his whole attitude changed. He became pushy and aggressive. And eventually, something uncomfortable started becoming obvious to me. None of these men had really been interested in who I was. Not in the way I'd imagined, anyway. They saw an attractive woman who was clearly having relationship problems and assumed I'd be easy. These confident, successful, ambitious men I'd been so impressed by weren't lining up because they saw some incredible future with me. Most of them were looking for something temporary with a woman they considered vulnerable and available. Meanwhile, I started hearing little updates about Brandon through mutual friends. Apparently, he'd gotten promoted at work. What surprised me most was finding out he'd actually been working toward that promotion for months. He'd just never talked much about it. Then I heard he'd started seeing a therapist. He'd also started exercising regularly. Our friend Natalie eventually posted pictures from a hiking trip, and Brandon was in them. He looked different. Healthier. Happier. More confident. And that bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Because somehow, Brandon was becoming the person I'd kept telling him I wanted him to become. He was just doing it without me. Then, about 6 months after our breakup, something happened that hit me harder than anything else. I ran into Brandon at the grocery store. And he wasn't alone. There was a woman with him. I'd never seen her before. She was pretty, but not the kind of woman who immediately turned every head in the room. And physically, she was probably somewhere around the size I'd been before losing all that weight. She was laughing at something Brandon had said. But what really got me was the way she looked at him. She looked at Brandon like he was the most interesting man in the entire world. And suddenly, I remembered something. That was exactly how I used to look at him. Back when I appreciated what I had instead of constantly wondering whether something better was waiting around the corner. Brandon noticed me. Our eyes met for a second. He gave me a polite nod. But he didn't walk over. He didn't try to start a conversation. He simply went back to shopping with this woman who clearly adored him exactly as he was. And that's when something finally hit me. Maybe Brandon hadn't been the problem. Maybe I had. I'd taken a man who loved me unconditionally and slowly convinced him that he was worthless because he didn't match some fantasy I'd created in my head. I'd traded a real person for the possibility of something better. And now? I had my perfect body. I had my empty apartment. And I had dating apps filled with men who seemed interested in me for one reason and one reason only. That's the cruel irony of everything. I finally got all the attention I'd spent years wishing for. But almost all of it was superficial. Nobody seemed interested in knowing the person underneath anymore. They wanted the package I'd turned myself into. Brandon knew me before any of that. He knew me when I wasn't special. When nobody noticed me. When I wasn't confident or successful or turning heads everywhere I went. And he loved me anyway. Now I'm supposedly someone special, and somehow, nobody loves me the way he did. But whatever. I'm not going to sit here blaming myself forever just because I wanted something better out of life. Brandon had a choice. He could have tried harder. He could have stepped up. He could have become the man I needed him to be. Instead, he chose to walk away and find someone who was willing to accept his mediocrity. So that's his loss. Not mine.